Thank you, everyone. Thanks for this kind invite to be at TEDx today. And what a better place than Pune, which is known as Vidyate Mahir. So let's begin with my first story. So a few years ago, I met a very bright 10-year-old curious child. He was excellent with solving puzzles. In fact, he was so good, he could solve the trickiest within few seconds to minutes. But he hated to read and could barely write even a single sentence. His mother whispered to me and in a panicky voice, and she said that her child has been avoiding school since the past 1 year. Every day was a task between this harrowed mom, the dreaded school bus, and the tearful son. Things were so bad that this child was now at home since the past 2 months. And you know how things are in India. 2 months and well meaning neighbors and anxious relatives cornered this mom and asked her, "Don't you think this behavior is abnormal? I think we think you should definitely show your child to a doctor." And that's how this young family landed up to see me in my clinic. There, again, the mom was very tearful and she said, "Doctor, do you think he ever will be normal?" And that question really stunned me to the core. It made me stop back in my tracks literally because it made me rethink, really, what is normal? Who decides what is normal? What is abnormal? What are the variations between normal? Because if this child is different, he definitely is not deficient. Because differences cannot be deficiencies for sure. Because every child's brain is wired differently in its own unique way. The goal isn't to fix differences, but it's to understand and celebrate them. When I realized this as a trained doctor, it made me stop again in my tracks and it changed me. This moment changed me forever. So, friends, I think I'm a pediatric neurologist and a trained developmental disorders specialist. And my area of interest is knowing how the brain studies, okay? Or when we study, how does the brain learn? So I realized that when we are reading, when a child is reading a word or solving a problem or even daydreaming, millions of neurons literally lit up in different areas of the brain. Okay? And this is where these pathways are used over and over again, and these pathways are then defined in the brain. However, in children with specific learning disorders, these pathways are wired differently. And these children, say, if you ask them to read a particular word, the brain may take a more scenic route, is what I would say, to arrive to a comprehension of that word. It's definitely slower than a neurotypical child, but it also leads to more scenic destinations. Neuroscience has proved without doubt that there are certain areas of the brain which are used for reading, right? If we are right-handed, then left-handed is the dominance in right-handed people. But in children with dyslexia, they have more of right hemispheric connections. And these are the connections or pathways which are responsible for creativity, imagination, and innovation. So children with dyslexia think in pictures, not just words. I think the specific learning disorder is the silent, hidden pandemic happening in our classrooms. Do you know that 2 or 3 students in a classroom of 30 students suffer from specific learning disorders silently? Most of them go undiagnosed, unrecognized, and unsupported in our system. When I have been training, We were always trained as medical doctors to diagnose, to label, to fix. However, during my path and career as a medical doctor, children and families have taught me otherwise. They have taught me to seek deeper meaning in the work that I do. I have been witness to see immense guilt that parents carry if the child is not doing well. They feel somehow they failed this child. I have seen children with neurodivergence slowly lose out their spark and confidence because they couldn't fit into a system which was built for sameness. And over that, I have realized my role. I have realized that my role as a trained neurologist is not just to read brain MRI scans or to hand out medications, but it is to help these families rediscover hope. And I will not be wrong in saying that in doing so, I have rediscovered parts of myself too. It has been a great learning and understanding journey. We all have our learning differences, don't we? But some of us have been plain lucky or even privileged, I would say, have been identified, understood earlier on, and lucky to be accepted for what we are. One of my unforgettable stories was of a young boy who ran from home twice. He was labeled as slow and isolated in the classroom. This boy was found in a neighboring state's railway platform, right? And he was hungry and tired and scared. Imagine the plight of the parents. 6 days later, because there was an FIR filed by our state police station, a kind social worker had identified him on the railway platform and taken him to a shelter home. And this call from the police station reached to the shelter home. The social worker identified him and brought him home back to safety. This child was then evaluated, and a lot of tests, we realized that this child had a hidden undiagnosed dyslexia. With the right support, within 6 months, he started to read. And that was like a big thing for us. But the main game changer was during this process, this child realized that he loved to use his hands. He loved to build machines. He was doing Lego models building with great creativity, confidence, and imagination. And that was the game changer. He became confident of his skills, and that increases confidence and self-worth eventually. Years later, when he met me as a young, confident adult, he told me, "Doctor, I have realized," he really reflected on his journey and he said, "I think in pictures, and that's my superpower." And he was right. And friends, when we move from asking what's wrong with this child to asking what works for this child, true transformation begins. Again, going to my postgraduate days of training, the thrill was in making the diagnosis. It was like being Sherlock Holmes, gathering all the clues from the child's history and the examination, investigation, and putting to a pattern of what was the diagnosis and doing treatment. However, with grays in my hair and with time, my neurodivergent children and my children with their families have taught me otherwise. They've taught me that medicine isn't just the science of the body. It is the art of listening. It's the art of listening to the said and unsaid stories of children and their families. And it is through them that I have discovered the true meaning of hope, courage, patience, and perseverance. The true courage to be different in a world filled with sameness. And every child's brain, I think, is an unfinished symphony. Some play a different rhythm, but that rhythm still dances. I implore you today, not just as a medical doctor, but as a fellow human being, to all the educators, parents, children, young friends sitting here in the audience, believe in the child. Be kind, not critical in your approach. Be curious, not judgmental. Be responsive, not reactive in your parenting. Because when we celebrate differences, we don't just change lives, we expand ourselves of being and we understand what it means to be a true human being. In the end, I would conclude that inclusion of these children and their families in our society and community isn't just an act of kindness or favor on our part, it's an act of wisdom on our part. Supporting them isn't lowering our expectations of them, but it's unlocking the true potential of the child. Because in the end, the goal of learning isn't to make every child fit in the same mold, it's to help each one discover the wonder in the way we are wired. Thank you for a patient hearing.